Natalia Kulik, who is writer, moderator, and program coordinator, working mainly with Utrecht in Dialogue, but also with BAK at the opening of this project. Natalia will moderate the forthcoming relay series of conversations, and you, I think, will introduce your speakers. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Almost. I'm not a writer. Just to clarify, I'm not a writer. You will not find my publications anywhere. I do believe there are already microphones circulating in the audience. Is it true? No. Okay, they are here. Well, I hope somebody will make use of those speakers here, of those microphones here. Please feel free to join whenever. The only rule I ask you to follow is that you don't say the word "but" when you try to add something from yourself, because we are trying to create this space where we share ideas and we explore ideas. So if you just follow that one rule, I think it's going to go great. My first speaker, actually my two speakers, are Jun, hello, Jun Saturay, and Matthijs de Bruijne. Hi. Hi, good to see you. Jun, I already met you once in the previous, in the previous meeting. Where's your microphone? Just here.
Not so used to having my. Hello.
Yes.
Okay.
So we met already at a previous project back in September. It was part of the Not Yet conversations, and we were talking there at the staircase, also about the Not Yet, and it's really nice to have you back and be able to talk to you again. For those who do not know yet, Jun is an activist from Philippines. He's involved in Basic Activist Kitchen. And back in the Philippines, he was working with a participatory theater.
Yes.
And I hope you will be able to tell us more about that. And Matthijs, welcome. I know that you are the fellow, used to be a fellow, and you did those projects that I was really impressed with. One was with Cartoneros in Buenos Aires, where I think this actually will be a great link to start with, because you found out or came across this community or a social group where they were completely excluded. And, well, I've never heard of that, and it was really great for me to find out that an artist can engage with a group and bring their voice to the surface and make everybody realize what this group is going through. It's very empowering what you did. And your work, Jun, with participatory theater was of a similar character?
Yes, it's a similar character. I used to do community theater, and we use theater to conduct health education. So we use role playing and basic acting and community theater to learn about how to confront some very, very common community health issues. We used to work with indigenous people who don't read and who don't write. So in the absence of something that you can, give them books or instructions, we use theater. And it was through that I became involved as well in environmental activism. The community that I was working with were fighting a big mining corporation from Norway at that time, and they said that it was going to cause a lot of health problems. So in that way, the health and the environmental became connected. So, and then because it was a conflict, the government sent in a lot, the Philippine government sent in a lot of soldiers to the area that we were working in. So that also escalated human rights violations. So everything became tied together, and theater became the best way to communicate with a lot of people. So during demonstrations, we would go on stage and perform about how the people's health were affected by the mining and were affected by militarization. But it also had consequences. We became the target of the Philippine government because they said that we were conducting radical and subversive theater presentations. But because I used to be a surgeon, I wasn't, this wasn't my field before. I would sit like this in a lecture, but I would be talking about pathology and anatomy, not about art.
But your work was actually very successful, at least initially, because the mining project was stopped.
Yes, we were able to force the government to declare a moratorium for 25 years, so there would be no mining in that island for 25 years. But that was overturned later because they said that the dictates of globalization, the government had responsibilities to allow mining corporation, according to the World Trade Organization, to allow them to explore and to operate the mine. So it's still a problem. It was not a solution, but it was a problem. But it gave an opportunity for the people to learn and understand the implications of mining. Not just the environmental thing, but the social implications as well. The loss of livelihood, the communities being driven away from where they have been living for hundreds of years, the destruction, and yeah.
Could you go into a greater detail in how exactly was that performed? Because I'm not sure if the audience is familiar with the whole story. I know for a fact that it was a great cooperation and that the theater was presenting at many different locations. They were invited to present the plays at many different locations, institutions. Can you say more about that, about this cooperation and how it actually worked out?
It's not a professional theater company as you would probably imagine. The performers and the writers are all from the communities. We had some students who came from the universities. Most of them were dropouts. We had volunteers from urban poor communities, people who used to drink a lot, but then they learned about the mining problem and they wanted to help. So they came with us and we tried to study first, learn about what the problem was. So we needed to educate ourselves. And you can't do that with just books, and we didn't have internet then. So we had to live in the communities, and we had to go with the farmers to work with them. So we learned exactly their cycle of life, their daily life. We went to the indigenous people, and we got educated about their culture. I used to be very arrogant. I thought, okay, I would go to the mountains and teach the indigenous people about how to use herbal medicines. It was so stupid of me. They knew much more, and I spent like 8 years trying to learn. I became their student. But education for us meant we had to copy what they were doing, how they were planting, and they had to come and show us. So in that way, they were acting. And later, we would write scripts together because they don't write. So everything is by memory. And we would perform in big demonstrations on top of trucks. And because I had a family, so my children were always with us. And they would perform. And that was the best education that they say that they've ever had. My children would play guitar and they would sing with indigenous people. One of my daughters, Elena, came up to me. She was, I think, 5 or 6 years old then, and she asked me if she was an indigenous person, because she spoke the language, she was always playing, and she was different because she was fair-skinned compared to the indigenous people. But that stuck to her, and until now, she's passionate about trying to help the indigenous people. She became a Dutch citizen, but she left the Netherlands to work with indigenous people, and until now, it's still a strong decision for her to work there at the grassroots.
So let me just welcome Yasmin Ahmed. She's an activist at the Political Youth Collective. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm translating into English. It's Revolutionary Unit, right? Unity. Thank you. Welcome. What I hear from you, Jun, is that it was you admitted that you said that you were full of it when you came to the people who needed your help, thinking that you will teach them. Well, it was actually them who had to pass the knowledge to you. And so it came with a big learning curve for you to actually understand and be able to help them. But ultimately, this collaboration, it was very successful. And I think this is also similar way how you worked with cartoneros, Matthijs, because you also needed to go into that community. You came really close to them to know their personal stories, and the project that I saw online with the object, the liquidation, that it seems like you weren't just a typical observer. You really had to work closely with them to understand their stories. Can you tell us more about this project?
Well, I think at that moment I used to be more, let's say, more or less a normal artist. A normal artist who went with a grant to Argentina, middle-class background, living in a middle-class area. But there was one problem at that moment. There were no institutions anymore because the whole Argentinian state collapsed completely. So all the museums, all the galleries, everything was closed. So not only me, but many other artists had to go on the street in order to work. You were not able to anymore to work inside, let's say, an institution. And so I started to work with cartoneros who were literally working, let's say, with my garbage, and that was a starting point. After this project, you could say I got in touch with 2 other kinds of institutions. The first institution was the main newspaper from Argentina, who started to write about this project. And the second institution was the Goethe Institute from Germany, who was quite important at that place. And at that moment, they were organizing an exhibition about the situation in Argentina as an example of what could happen also in Europe. At that moment, nobody thought it could happen also in Europe, because we in Europe are better organized, of course. But in fact, in 2008, something similar happened also in Europe. So I would say there are many differences, I think, between, let's say, how I was working at that moment and how Jun was working in the Philippines.
Could you tell us more about the lack of institution? And because I guess we are just used to the idea that the art has to be mandated by somebody. It has to be approved in order to be really valuable, which is completely not the case. In this situation, what I see as well is that you created this great piece of work, in my opinion, that is also relevant and that came really from life. You were inspired by real life and real people, and through that you also gave voice to those who were normally excluded from those institutions. So in a way, I actually find it pretty ironic, but in a good way, that institutions were not supporting that project, because you actually were able to give them the voice they needed, or at least the voice that they could, normally they wouldn't have received this opportunity to speak about themselves.
Well, in a country as Argentina, I would say that the main art institutions are not representing a big part of the population. But I would also say exactly the same thing about this in the Netherlands. I don't see any difference between these two situations. Art, for me, is also a way to exclude people. And it's what I say, it's completely not a neutral place. It is it's representing a certain group of the society, and usually the group who has power. In Argentina, let's say at one moment that's also what I mentioned. There are two other institutions, like for example, a Goethe Institute is not that. It's quite important in this kind of places. Alliance Française, Goethe Institute, because Argentina has a kind of extremely love-hate relation with Europe. So they look around all the time. Everything from Europe is always better, and they hate it in the same time. So there isn't this relationship also creates. If some Germans come to Argentina to organize a huge project, I think the whole budget of that project was 1 million. Euros at that moment. That isn't a lot of money, especially for that time. So that directly also this creates a very difficult situation in relation to the Argentinian institutions because they were out of money. So there is, I would say you always are working for somebody, and you can better choose for whom you would like to work.
Yeah, maybe that should be the question, because we were also talking about money before and about, what money buys. And we are, especially in the art institutions, unfortunately, we rely on funding, and this money is not blank. It has a meaning, and there is an agenda attached to it. But yeah, it is a good point. It's who you take the money from and how you are using it in the end, and it can be used on your terms as well. And maybe I would like to include you, Jasmine, as well. And maybe you can tell us about your relation to the theme, to the not yet. What does it mean to you, the not yet?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Well, I think it very much, I want to continue on this line of conversation because I think it's quite relevant when you mentioned about the kind of assigning of value to art. Like art generally goes through this curation where it gets valuable, and suddenly you have Damien Hirst, the state of like paying like what like 20 million or something for a giant extravagant Damien Hirst thing, whereas you can also have art institutions like BAK who are more putting their, like with the trainings for the not yet, they were putting their money into actually rather than an art piece being something to be consumed for a certain price, and that is of this abstract value to the people who come to see it, you have a project that actually brought people together to collectively create. And we saw that during the process of things that were created during the trainings being added to the walls, and the art space being a communal space rather than this institution. So for me, coming from quite a radical political organization. We organize along anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and proletarian feminist lines. It was very strange for us to be participating in the activist kitchen in an art institution. We usually cook as part of our organizing. We have monthly benefit dinners, and in all our events that we have open to the public, we like to make dinner and sit together with the people who come to it to actually be able to engage with them. So moving into an art institution, even like the fact that the kitchen is like a proper Horeca kitchen, was a completely different experience, and one that there was a conversation earlier about how the relationships are built, and I think it's quite a simple answer, really. It's just being more human in all our interactions and being more intentional in all our ways of working together and talking about the contradictions that exist. Because yeah, we are able to access some of the funding that was available for the activist kitchen, and they are coming from a state that we have been repressed by in previous actions that we've done. So I think you need to be able to talk about the contradictions and be transparent, as was said earlier. And I think I would just want to state one more thing is that when we were talking about earlier, Jana was talking about the art object becoming a learning object, and I think that's a crucial component of it, and that is contributing to art if the art institution changes its role of a place for art to be observed, rather to somewhere where culture is being cultivated. And I'm talking about a counterculture. And I was really happy that Maria mentioned the propaganda thing earlier, because that's something I wanted to talk about. We also talked about language a lot. And I think, yeah, all art is propaganda, because propaganda is propagating ideas and information. And we see capitalist propaganda everywhere, like in advertisements. And on the Kalverstraat now, they have Christmas lights that say, "Shop never stop." Like that's very strong messaging there. And I think if we can understand that the role of art is to reflect our actual reality, and also artists to take on that as being cultural workers, as a term, to see their role, because there's political work, there's cultural work, there's economic work, which is something that we can separate all and talk about at length. But I just think that the main thing is that you have to be aware that we want to go from a culture that is consumerist to one that is based on trying to create, and not an individualist process, but a collective process. And I think that an institution like this does hold a certain power, and to give space to people who don't hold any power, and actually try, relating to what Jun was said about learning from the indigenous communities, it's the same kind of relationship where institutions can be opening their space to learn from grassroots initiatives, and give space so that grassroots collectives and projects and people who are working for social and economic transformation that can exist with ecological sustainability need to be supported in growing, and need to just be given the space. Yes.
I have a question about that, because there's this. I totally agree with you. I think this is an important mode of exchange, but I often worry that institutions sometimes engage in this practice as an extractive practice rather than as one that is, I don't know, generative, and it's a fine line, and there's certain ethics there. So I just wonder, what you guys think about that.
Maybe I will just quickly explain. I see that the setup changed a bit, so maybe we can just all join. Yeah, sorry.
But you can join us as well.
I think it was a bit improvised today, but doesn't matter. We are exercising anyways. So I will just sit here, and if you don't mind, I will moderate from here.
So the question was how to not make it just an extraction. I think after this months-long project with the trainings for the non-yet and the activist kitchen, there's a lot of assessment to do and conversations to have, because a lot of things went really well, but I know that there was a lot of people being overworked, and just there's always the conversation about how is the labor, what labor is being visible and what labor is invisible, and I really think that the answer to these things is really talking about the imbalances, and it just starts with discussing it. It starts with having meaningful conversations about the dynamics that are at play, and being committed to doing it with an openness and not a defensiveness, and an understanding that we a kind of holding on to the shared vision, so that we can then work through. You have to struggle for unity, that's the thing, and that exists with all of these. There's a lot of different power dynamics that are at play in all of this, and I think that it's just the transparency and the openness and understanding where each person is coming from and how to and like the great task ahead of us of actually trying to save the planet so that we don't go extinct, because the planet will keep surviving, and do it in, and I think that we already are practicing that. In small communities, you can see this, what we want to achieve. So the not yet is already like existing on a small scale, and it's about, yeah.
I'd like to pick up something from what you said and from what Laura was speaking about, the idea of neutrality. I think after listening to you, I kind of think that it's about what is mutually acceptable to parties. So it depends really on who the parties are. But in this environment in particular, since I've worked in BAK for 1.5 to 2 years now, I used to work technique and then doing stuff for the building and now at the kitchen. I've been working with a lot of people who have ideas about changing the world, from this shitty world to a better one. I've watched, I've listened to Matthijs, and I was so blown away by the Tukaman Arde discussions. I've worked with Yasmin, and I've worked with Isshaq, and it seems that the mutually acceptable neutrality for us is the commonality of wanting to change the world. And I think it's important, like for artists and workers inside the institution, to embrace it, to totally take ownership of it, be part of the institution. And I think if we don't do that, I myself am very cautious about working with institutions. I had huge mistrust for that. But when I came to BAK, I thought, maybe this is worth giving a chance. It's not perfect, really, but there's a big possibility of change, not just within the institution, but also the direction where institutions are going. I kind of liken it to Maria during one of her first lectures that I heard. I was working there as a technician doing light and sound, and she described something about the old refusing to die and the new cannot be born. So it's stuck in my head as a vision of childbirth. I kind of look at institutions, not just art institutions, but different institutions as midwives in the process of childbirth. So who's going to cut the umbilical cord? I see midwives who are trying to stop the birth, and I see midwives trying to say, push, push, push. You know, and I see the art institution as like having this big something to cut chains. You know? Because I kind of imagine the new as being born with a chain to the old, and it has to be disconnected if we want to change it. So I think the biggest role of our art institution now is to prepare people for changes. But it's a big challenge. I can imagine the fear of the more conservative institutions, so they would try to maintain that neutrality image. You know? But there should be daring ones who would declare themselves as, you know, the midwives who would cut the chains of oppression.
Can I just quickly introduce as well Isshaq Al-Barbary, who is the person behind the project Campus in Camp, which I think ties perfectly with what is being discussed. Maybe you can tell us more about this collaboration with the universities, between universities and the camp.
Yeah, I'm not really, I'm one of many, so I'm not behind it. Otherwise, I feel like
contributor,
museum style, you know. Yeah. I would like to actually relate a little bit to the title itself, Training for the Not Yet. And I would like to speak from two different levels. One, my personal experience with it, on the level that it really took me back to the experience of campus in camps. And I will speak a little bit about this. It's very important. But to my actual personal experience, because I took part in different trainings. This is why I look this way. I've been greatly engaged. It's true. And I'm a student in HKU, So I have deadlines, and I have been missing my deadlines. And this is quite interesting because I was only able to write my papers because of the trainings. And I really mean this, because one thing that I sort of enjoyed the most in these spaces that you are the host. And if we want to speak about relations with institutions, power dimensions, this is very important. So I was able to bring the topics that I'm supposed to write on to these spaces, and together with other people, work it out. So these are living spaces. And I say living spaces because training for the not yet, I never understood it as it's all about the future. There's a unity. You bring the present, the past, and the future together, and that's where the rethinking relationship takes place as well. It's based on reflections, it's based on exchanging practice knowledge, and it's based on how can we articulate that in imagining a future. And I think that's the uniqueness of this space. So this is my experience with it. I come from an educational program called Campus in Camps. In Arabic, we say Jama'a fil Mukhayyam. And Jama'a means university, but in its literal meaning, it means gathering. So basically, it's gathering in the refugee camp. We chose campus, the university campus. We did not choose the university because we knew and we are aware that we are interested in certain spaces or in some spaces in the institutions. We're not interested in the institution the way it is. And I think that's very important to think about how do we want to relate to institutions. They are so strong, they can easily hijack us, manage us, but then how can we manipulate this power? So the idea was to invite the university to come to the refugee camp because we believe that the refugee camp has a lot of knowledge that can offer to the university. So it's based on this sort of beliefs that the campus in camps take a place. But above all, it focuses on the lives of the participants as well. So on the everyday practice. And when I say the life of the participants, here it goes into art, it goes into culture, it goes into different fields because it's living, and that's the refugee camp as well. So you create a kitchen where you deal with all different relations. So this is also how I see, how I would like to relate to the title, as a matter of fact.
Can you also tell us more about the relationship in greater detail, the relationships that were built during this project between the refugee camp and the campus? How was the cooperation?
There are different relations. So there were relations based on demands in the sense that university has a lot of power, including financial power. So we would take their money. So that's one relation. But also they have the resources, and we were greatly interested in speaking with people that, I mean, obviously we are under occupation, so, you know, hardly people can travel. And hardly we can also invite other people to come from other places. So we never wanted for the refugee camp to be looked at as a singular place. And I would like to relate this a little bit to the whole idea of neutrality as well. So we would ask the university to reach out to people that we choose and make sure that they bring them to us. And with bringing them, they get them visas, you know, they take care of all the finance, all of that things. So for us, we just enjoy this space in creating conversation with these people that we feel we have urgencies to discuss with them. So I'm very particular about the relations as well. But for us, relation is truly the relation that we were creating amongst ourselves and the space itself. Because the whole idea for us was, we have been deceived for long, and it's about time that we start to rethink our relationship with ourselves, with the space that we come from. And maybe to relate a little bit to the whole idea of neutrality, the first thing, one of the first initiatives we did in Campus in Camps, we coordinated with 3 different refugee camps, the Heeshal, Az, and Aida, and we said the camp is not a museum, the camp is not a zoo. At that time, none of us ever been to a museum, and I think this is very important. Why would people say the camp is not a museum, although they've never been to a museum, right? Because the museum travels to us that way. And it travels to us in different ways because obviously we engage all activists and artists come to the refugee camp under what they call solidarity, and I'm generalizing here, while many of them, they came for refugee tourism. So they enjoy the zoo, and then they go and they set up their exhibitions in the museums. And we said, we cannot allow for this to happen. But also we cannot allow for you to come and enjoy the beach in Tel Aviv and live there, and you come for 2 hours to the refugee camp. So we are aware of the whole idea of neutrality. You do not normalize the oppressed and the oppressor together. So that's also relation with institutions.
And
because the individual is an institution in this respect. This is what I'm trying to say.
And I think what you said, Jasmine, that we are already practicing it, and as we practice, we just need to question it and make sure that it actually serves our purpose and that it's aligned with our values. I think this is what we can do. And in all of these cases, I actually see that we are all doing something for the not yet. And where this is taking us, how do you see the future of your work in this context of not yet and working with institutions? How would you imagine working with institutions?
I can answer to that. Well, personally, in my case, I've been working the last 10 years inside Union of Cleaners. It's a bit a different case, so I would not use the word not yet. Maybe I was the person not yet, maybe. Because I joined an organization with members, what is also an institution, by the way. That organization went through a so-called renovation. And one very important part of the renovation was democratization. So what happened, how it used to be, let's say, for 15 years, is that the shop stewards, the kaderleden, were not representing the workers. So in order to change that, they introduced a democracy with a parliament, with a government, with a president. I have a president, and they are representing the workers. And also, so that's why I call, let's say, myself the not yet. I was the person who was working, let's say, for and with them, and also in order to renovate this whole organization, to change it.
So the question is, it was, in your view, an art project, wasn't it?
No.
No, how would you then define
art
it?
Project? Maybe let's say the first question you had that was an art project. That's why I was telling you I used to be a normal artist. Let's say I think I discussed it with Simon just before we start and about because Simon is also an activist in the trade union, and he said we in the trade union we need a culture, we need art inside, because without our own culture you don't exist. And you don't know who you are. And if something goes wrong, and you're focused too much, let's say, on, court cases and things like this, if you lose these court cases, what is left over? Nothing. So that's why I think art inside a political movement is fundamental. That is also the position, like I as an artist has inside this political movement, is to work with for them, and in order that they can achieve their own languages, their own words. And that is, I think that is fundamental.
I had a chance to witness the growth of the protests, the actions during that time. One time my family and I were at the central station, and the cleaners had occupied the central station. My daughter Marikit was, I think, 9 or 10 at that time, and she was so inspired by the songs, by the talks, by how powerful people felt because they were together, and they even had an exhibition there, and she was so inspired. She asked permission from us, the parents, mother and father, to go on stage and speak. And she spoke about her mother being a cleaner during that time. Their status was not yet clear, so they sort of identified with being undocumented, but they were house cleaners, and everybody that she knew in the Filipino community were undocumented house cleaners, and she identified with the interest of the cleaners who were demonstrating at that time. And I think the role of art there, through the songs, through the chants, and it bound the cleaners in such a strong way.
Maybe you're telling about a really interesting moment, because it's 2010. And we are talking about institutions and how to institution otherwise. Yeah. One of the problems the trade union at that moment of the cleaners had was there were not that many women who were representing the workers. And mainly most of the workers in the Netherlands, cleaners, are women. Yes. So there was something wrong. And then is the question, how can you change this? And this is because sometimes this whole democratic process also didn't work completely in the right way. So still, I think the first parliament, the majority of the members of the parliament were men. And then you are facing the problem, okay, then how to deal with this kind of issues? And then I think there is also the responsibility, let's say, of the union administrators, or let's say managers in a way, to manage in a certain way that this organization opens up better and you get a better form of representation.
Yes, I agree with you. But when you went on this fellowship, again, Marikit saw your exhibition here, and it totally gave her more inspiration. And I think the role of the artist, engaging with people who have struggles or concerns, allows those concerns to enter the institution, to be shown in this because I can't imagine like the Filipino struggle coming to BAK to do presentations. I could never imagine that. But when the artists came to BAK and said, we want to present the art and cultural movement of the Philippines at BAK. They were invited by Jonas and BAK. And that gave us a lot of hope. That gave us a lot of inspiration. So from the cleaners being here at BAK, the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines, who is engaged in a revolution for national and social liberation, was at BAK. We've heard the struggles of the Palestinian people here at BAK, the struggles of the Kurdish people, the struggles of, I have a long list, and I think it's important to explore these possibilities. Otherwise, art institutions will perish like dinosaurs because they will not be relevant. New structures will be built in the future, in the not yet. And in order for the art institution to survive, to be present when the not yet is here, it has to be able to adapt and serve a purpose.
We said before that not yet, it's not really a future, that we are in the not yet, because we don't know what's going to happen, so we are checking our options and we are just trying to figure out how it's going to be. And we are preparing ourselves by testing those different propositions. And maybe it is the case that these institutions will have to be changed, but maybe it will be the case that they will completely perish, like you say. But maybe it's also the case that some will transform one way or another, but how does this transformation can take place?
I have something that I want to add to what you were talking about in terms of this is titled Rethinking Relationships, the future of art institution. But I think we also need to rethink our relationship to art and what is art and who can be an artist. And the answer should be everyone, because we all have, humans I think are innately creative in some ways. I mean, I think maths is a very creative thing, but it's never really termed like that. And we have this, there's real gatekeeping on what skills validate you as an artist. And I think the trainings for the not yet have also brought in, like, I'm not an artist, I'm an activist, but in the last like months and years, as I've been kind of deconstructing these questions in my head, I've realized, oh, anyone can be an artist. It's not about your level of skills in, I don't know, brush strokes or lyricism. Well, I think, yeah, of course, we value the things that are valuable, but the fact is that everyone can create something to reflect their own reality and like just present ideas in a creative way. And I think that is a conversation that also has to be as part of these trainings for the not yet. When you put the question, what comes next? I'm thinking that it's a slow process, and I don't think when we talked about institutions being static earlier, I think that's a huge problem to be identified, because this is an ongoing process. We don't really. It's not like we even have defined the answer. We're just defining more questions to ask. So I think that also the question of the artist, and I think it goes back to our current culture, which is very individualistic, and we have this kind of romanticization of the tortured artist who sits away on their own creating art. But what does that mean then? What does that art mean? I think the cultural shift is really great, and I think that requires a very intentional and very thoughtful process on the part of art institutions.
Yeah, it sort of gave us a venue, to a place, a space, or opportunity to work together with people who are otherwise, we're not a homogeneous thinking mass of people. We have different politics, we have different ideologies, different skills, we have different communities and advocacies. But from my experience, this is the first time I've worked in an art institution, it gave us a space to work with different people. I'm having conversations with Laura, I'm having conversations with Maria, with Matthijs, with Yasmin, with Ying, and we sort of put all our ideas on the table and cooked up a meal, you know, and that's where the BAK activist kitchen came from, that idea of coming together, bringing ingredients and preparing something, and then sharing the meal that comes out of it.
I think that's a perfect moment to also finish. Unless somebody has a question, there is a moment for last question. Exactly. That wasn't planned, but it was perfectly planned, yes. Thank you.